Well, hey guys, it's good to talk to you via Screencast anyway. And I wanted to first of all say that I really enjoyed our conversation in class yesterday and our discussion about citizenship and education and some of the perspectives that we can think about related to that from a comparative and international or through a comparative and international lens. And I had a couple more things to say because, as we go through this, remember that we're trying to highlight the core parts of the PhD program content that we want to make sure that everybody has a grasp on and an awareness of. So let me just walk through this a little bit more. We looked at this quote from Benedict Anderson's 1991 book, Imagined Communities, and I want to just highlight it again. He says, "What makes people love and die for nations as well as hate and kill in their name?" And our discussion came up that often we create our civic identity and our identity as a whole and as an opposition to other groups rather than as a development or a sort of a positive affirmation of community. And I think that's true, but I don't think that's all that this quote focuses on. So, what makes people love and die for nations? And that is a unique question. And remember, the nation and the state are not necessarily the same thing. Nations generally have a cultural or an ethnic component to them that goes beyond the political state or is only a part of the political state or vice versa. And that love and die for something that is an entity, that is an imagined community of people based on characteristics that may not always be easily articulated, is a really important component. And a very important element of how we can think about schools and what educational systems either provide or enhance or reproduce or whatever word we want to use. And I think that's key. And we have to think about where education fits into that phenomenon of creating such an affinity for a particular group, such a sense of identity and belonging that someone would love sort of the ultimate emotion, as well as die, the ultimate sacrifice for that imagined community. Where does education fit into that? Well, certainly we can argue that, and this is, I think, important to recognize, that educational systems are in some way responsible for the creation and the worldwide spread of the idea of even imagined communities, of nations, right? That we can conceptually grasp that this is an entity is one thing. But I think we also have to slice it a couple of different ways and remember that imagined communities and nations that pop up out of these imagined communities aren't just tied to the political state. So it's not just the United States or Armenia or South Africa or Saudi Arabia or whatever. Right? An imagined community could be a community of those who have participated in formal education systems. That could be a way of thinking about what your community is. So maybe I'm not, speaking now personally, maybe I'm not an American, even though I hold an American passport. Maybe instead I would consider myself part of the community of the educated, of the scholarly, something silly like that, right? But that's not really silly after all. It's a pretty strong affinity because I, with I think everyone I'm talking to who's listening to this, and most other people that I probably will come in contact with around the world, have participated to some degree in very similar experiences, at least institutionally similar experiences of going to school, sitting in classrooms, of learning particular curriculum, of the divorce between that curriculum and what's really needed when we get jobs. I mean, the whole 9 yards, right? We have those shared experiences and expectations as formally educated people that someone who hasn't had that same experience will not have. They will not share those expectations. They will not share the same values. They will not share all that stuff that we share as a result of being part of an education system. Now, we can also think of the role of mass education in unifying nations, and nations in that sort of traditional sense, as well as creating boundaries between nations and different groups within nation states. And this is something that I was trying to briefly explain when I was giving a quick overview of the article that I wrote with some colleagues, with Astis and Baker and Fabrega, a couple of years ago that got published in Compare, where we were looking at youth political socialization. And we were specifically looking at the effects of schooling on civic and citizenship knowledge, right? And we were finding that there were two trends going on. There were enhanced levels of knowledge and attitudes that were sympathetic to nationalism, to patriotic causes. But at the same time, there was a development of strong universal principles of human rights and social justice. Right? These aren't necessarily complementary expectations and knowledge. Right? Global citizenship and national citizenship do not always mix. And so the argument that partly we were making in that article was that mass education does have or does play this dual role of both unifying nations as well as creating boundaries across them or between them. You may have read for a previous course, I'd be surprised if you hadn't, some selections out of this book. And, it gets us thinking at a theoretical level whether or not there's any tension or conflict between the idea of a nation and the idea of a world society, which is just kind of what I was getting at a second ago. And we can ask, does globalization really reduce the importance and erase the boundaries of nation states? That is a really important and a key question. Because when we talk about globalization, we are usually talking about the exchange of goods, people, information, or services across boundaries of some sort. Right? And so it could be argued that globalization reduces the importance and erases the boundaries of these nation states in ways that can affect what we know and what we establish as worth knowing. That can be curriculum or other things. So, when we ask this question, then we come up with another one. Does modern mass education, by modern I simply mean contemporary, build nationalism or build global citizenship in youth? Or does it tear down communities of culture to make some sort of a bland, homogeneous world culture? Well, this leads us to be able to think about education in a couple of different ways. We can think about the centrality of education as a human right, which makes it an entitlement. We can think about it as human capital, which makes it an investment. Or we can think about, or in addition, we can think about the consequences of schooling beyond the simple acquisition of information. The socialization consequences, the certification and legitimation consequences, the ability to think of ourselves as part of a community, right? And that the information, the knowledge, the curriculum that we value and share as a result of that participation in our formal education system also certifies us and legitimizes us to be experts in particular areas or professionals in particular areas, or simply be thought of as, and here's the big thought coming, as human. Because there's a lot of evidence that those who have not participated in formal education systems are not given the same certification and legitimacy opportunities for being part of literally just society. Now we can also take an institutional lens. In addition to the book I just showed you by Gita, there's also a book by Baker and Latendre called National Differences and Global Similarities. Talks about world culture and what they are kind of sarcastically calling the future of schooling. And they talk a little bit about globally institutionalized expectations for nations. One of those being that states are increasingly powerful. Nation states even more so. And the question is that does world culture, or does a culture of education, or a culture that is disseminated by education with expectations about citizenship and curriculum and all those things, set common expectations for and among nation states, and in particular the educational systems that are supported and promoted by those nation states? So we can ask, how are globally shared expectations for nation states created? Is it through scripts and legitimacy and loose coupling? Is it through isomorphic change? Remember, that's that slow as a glacier change that is either coercive or mimetic or more normative. Is it through both exogenously, that's external, and endogenously, that's internal, driven construction or techniques or mechanisms? Or is it because of some sort of structuration, which is a way of talking about development beyond the functional requirements? So, for example, to do what I do for a living, I need a PhD simply for the certification and the legitimacy. But functionally, I could be doing this job without a PhD. Right? It simply has to do with what you know and what you can express. The degree is a functional requirement. That's it. Okay? So I've developed way beyond that. Yay! So how do these globally shared expectations for nation states and their curriculum or their ideas about citizenship develop and spread? These are some examples of how. So our questions so far: what makes people love and die for nations as well as hate and kill in their name? All right. Where does education fit into this phenomenon? Is there any tension or conflict between the idea of a nation and the idea of a world society? Does globalization really reduce the importance and erase the boundaries of nation states? Or does modern mass schooling build nationalism or global citizenship in youth? And does it tear down communities of culture to make a bland, homogeneous world culture? And then finally, does world culture set common expectations for and among nation states? And how are globally shared expectations for nation states created? And then, of course, what does any of this have to do with an imagined community? And why would we be talking about this in relation to either citizenship or curriculum development? Well, these are questions to ask and answer, and questions that I hope that we will have a chance to debate in class as well.